AFIO Now is presented by Northwest Financial Advisors, where our world revolves around you.
Hello, everyone. This is Jim Hughes with AFIO Now. We are a program of recorded interviews with former senior U.S. intelligence officers and those who write about them. Today, I have an amazing guest. His name is Patrick K. O'Donnell. He is a prolific, award-winning author and military historian. His articles have appeared in publications like Military History Quarterly, World War II magazine. Just an idea of some of his award-winning books. Beyond Valor won the Colby Circle Award. Washington's Immortals won the Amazon Award for History. But most interesting for this audience, his book, We Were One, won the OSS Society's John Waller Award. Patrick has a brand new book out, The Unvanquished. I have read it, and it's a fascinating read. Patrick, welcome to AFIO Now.
It's a pleasure and an honor to be with you, Jim.
Patrick, off camera, we were talking a little bit about some of the original source material that you were able to access for this book. Could you give our audience just a brief description of some of the source material that you were able to gain access to?
This book is mostly an untold story, and it was a deep dive into all primary sources within the scope of the book, which involves the Jesse Scouts, the Confederate Secret Service, and Mosby's Rangers. It's the Jesse Scouts in particular where I had to look at about 100 individuals in their biographies, and it's a deep dive into their stories, into various state archives, into various pension application files, to the National Archives, even to the New York Historical Society, you name it. There's a lot of different places to connect a lot of different dots to tell this story, which is a unique look at the American Civil War from the perspective of unconventional warfare and how specifically the South tried to use unconventional means and some novel special operations to change the outcome of the war. And on the other side of that perspective were the Jesse Scouts, who dressed as Confederates that were actively trying to halt their efforts as well as lead the armies. And they had their efforts directly led to some of the victories in the war that changed the outcome of the war.
Patrick, who were the Jesse Scouts and how did they get their name?
Jesse Scouts are really, I think, just an extraordinary set of individuals in the American Civil War, and it's largely an untold story. There were 7 medals of honor that were awarded to Jesse Scouts for their heroic activity behind the lines. But in most cases, it was a perilous pursuit to be a Jesse Scout. It was hazardous duty. And in many cases, the Jesse Scouts never survived the war, many of them. The origin of the Scouts begins in 1861 with John C. Fremont, who was a general officer in the Union Army at the time. And he was given command of the Western Command. And it's in St. Louis that John C. Fremont, who's also the first Republican candidate for president in 1856, a U.S. senator, but he was also known as the Pathfinder because he had some really extraordinary experience with the American West, especially in California. And it's here that he has he's in charge of the Western Department, which includes Missouri. And he brings in what he learned from the American West as an explorer. And this involved many scouts. And he forms a group of scouts. Many of them had great experience as explorers within his commands, but also attacking or defending themselves against Native Americans. And he forms this group of men that are very experienced in everything from marksmanship to scouting to what we now consider irregular warfare or unconventional warfare through their activities against Native Americans. And what you find is that John C. Fremont is married to an extraordinary woman, Jessie Fremont, who is the daughter of a U.S. senator, and she's just an extraordinary woman. And these men literally look up to her, and they name themselves after Jesse. And Jesse, who's one of my favorite quotes, is consider the better man of the two between John. She's just an extraordinary woman that's powerful, charismatic, and just can take care of business. And the men look up to her, and they name themselves after Jesse, the Jesse Scouts. And they really develop some incredible tradecraft. It's Jesse that is reported to be the person that advocates them wearing the enemy's uniform, which allowed them to blend in to, all these different unique situations and infiltrate behind Confederate lines. But their role is in Missouri, which is a very dangerous place. There's a lot of partisan warfare, if you will, at the time. And the Scouts developed their tradecraft here. And then they're moved to the Eastern Theater, which is now Western Virginia at the time, and this is 1862, where John C. Fremont is given command of that region of the war, in which would become West Virginia. And here there's rugged mountainous terrain. You need scouts to be able to probe ahead of your armies, to be able to provide you with tactical and strategic level intelligence. Also, there's different elements within these scouts that they're doing not only reconnaissance, but they're just dealing with different aspects of it. And what's so interesting about the scouts is they have a darker side. They're not conventional in the sense that the commanding officer of the scouts is a guy by the name of John C. Carpenter. And he literally will steal anything that's not nailed down. And he's got some really incredible tradecraft, but also just takes anything that's not nailed down, and he's literally cashiered out of the army. And it's almost the end of the Jesse Scouts. And a small remnant remains after Carpenter is cashiered out. Many of the scouts that are involved in his activities also leave. And they're passed to another command, because John C. Fremont refuses to serve under John Pope. And there's command issues. But the scouts then emerge. This small core group is passed from one command to another, and they become really a strategic level asset under General Sheridan.
Patrick, talk a little bit about Confederate officer John Mosby and his Rangers.
What you see in this book is a clash between the Scouts, in many cases, and Mosby's Rangers. And John Singleton Mosby is one of the most unique Confederate officers within the American Civil War. He begins as a lieutenant, as a cavalry officer. He leads Jeb Stuart's troops. There's a famous ride around Richmond. He's also does incredible reconnaissance work for Jeb Stuart. But then in 1862, asked Stuart to have his own command, to be a guerrilla operator. And Mosby begins with, Stuart says, okay, fine, you can have one guy with a club foot and make it all happen. And Mosby starts out, and it doesn't go well at all. His first week, he's literally captured at a train station by an entire company of Union cavalry. And he's captured, and he's in Union custody. But John Singleton Mosby is able to make lemons out of lemonade. And he's really, really an extraordinary individual. As he's being captured, he's in prison for several months with the Union authorities. And he's released on a prisoner exchange. And as he's being transported down the James River on a steamboat to Richmond, he recognizes that the captain of the boat has inclinations towards the south of the Confederacy. So he basically pries this guy, or pumps this guy for information about Union movements that are occurring. And he's able to put together the pieces of the puzzle on another Union offensive that's about to take place based on what the captain tells him, as well as his observations Union movement of Union units as he's moving down the river. It's really an extraordinary story. And instead of he's dropped off at Richmond, and instead of just he's been in captivity for several months, instead of just relaxing, he immediately rides to General Lee's headquarters to tell him that there's this strategic level intelligence, and it's directly responsible for one of the battles that occur shortly after that, a few days later at Cedar Mountain. It's John Singleton Mosby that plays a role there. Fast forward a few months to the winter of 1862, and we're outside of Middleburg, Virginia. And John Singleton Mosby then goes to his commanding officer again, Jeb Stuart, at a place called Oakham, which is a mansion that still exists. By the way, the book is about activity in Loudoun County, Prince William County, Fairfax County, areas of Northern Virginia and West Virginia that are still, these places can be visited, and they're extraordinary places to visit. And much of Loudoun County has still, it's still there. It still has the feel of the Civil War. It's an undeveloped area. You can still visit many of the safe houses that Mosby had, the skirmish areas, these farms, the mills, etc. The book is a driving tour in disguise in many ways. And Oakham is there, for instance, and it's at Oakham that he, again, requests that he has a corps of guerrilla fighters. And Stuart gives him a handful of men, and they set out. And this handful of men mushrooms into one of the greatest guerrilla organizations ever created in American history. They will, they expand to dozens of men, and they start to raid Union supply lines. And Mosby recognizes that it's not just about taking out a wagon train or two. It's about pinning down Union troops. And he recognizes that each one of these operations has the effect of the Union has to then pour hundreds, if not thousands, of troops into the area to deal with him. And therefore he's accomplishing his goals in that perspective. His greatest operation in that winter, though, is a high value target capture of General Stoughton. And the story is extraordinary. They infiltrate behind the lines, there's a massive Union cavalry encampment outside of Centerville and in Fairfax City at the time. And it's Mosby and his handful of men that are in disguise. They're wearing raincoats and in some cases portions of Union uniforms. And they also have the services of a Union cavalry sergeant who had deserted to Mosby's command to actively infiltrate into Fairfax City. They know the passwords because they have Ames working for them, this deserter. And they immediately they secure and seize General Stoughton and then exfiltrate from Fairfax City, capturing the general. It's an incredible story. And that is a tremendous windfall for Mosby's prestige. More men flock to his command. And as the war progresses, there are hundreds of men within multiple companies within Mosby's command. And he's developing a particular type of irregular warfare that is not only, cutting Union supply lines, it's also it's tying up massive numbers, tens of thousands in some cases, of Union troops. But he also has a psychological warfare aspect to this, where he's intimidating his Union foes, etc. Intertwined within this story is Mosby also actively works with the Confederate Secret Service on multiple different operations. And the book probes into the story of the Confederate Secret Service, which is also largely an untold story in many cases with the American Civil War.
Patrick, what are the similarities in terms of background and tactics for both the Jesse Scouts and Mosby's Rangers?
They both are they both utilize extraordinary individuals that that are, in most cases, they're smart individuals. They're good athletes. They're bold, daring. Both groups actively utilize what's known as the Rangers in particular are all about shock tactics. They immediately attack quickly and boldly. What they utilize is something called getting the bulge. They're trying to get the advantage, so they immediately attack so quickly that their adversaries are unable to do anything. And the Jesse Scouts are similar in many ways, but they provide a lot of reconnaissance. They utilize their enemies' uniforms for stealth and deception operations. It's the Jesse Scouts that are also maybe almost 100 years ahead of their time in some cases, though. The book deals with another untold aspect of the American Civil War, which is the story of America's arguably first proxy war against a European power, and that being how the Jesse Scouts were deployed against Maximilian in Mexico in 1865, where the French had tens of thousands of troops on the Mexican border. And it was General Sheridan's role to use unconventional warfare to deal with those troops. And the Jesse Scouts were sent down to run arms to the Mexican insurgency, as well as provide different operations to aid in their efforts, to train them. And then there were also deception operations to look within the scope of these activities. It's really a truly extraordinary story in how this small group of men were able to help eject a major European power from our border.
Describe for our audience a few of the more daring raids that the Jesse Scouts and the Mosby Rangers participated in.
With the Jesse Scouts, one of my favorite aspects of this book are how they literally helped shape the American Civil War through various battles that they participated in directly. And we're now in September. 160 years ago this month, the Jesse Scouts were actively involved in the Third Battle of Winchester, which combined with the Battle of Atlanta would change the course of the American Civil War, especially in terms of the election of 1864 and the trajectory of the war. Much of the war was being fought in the Shenandoah Valley, and it's at Winchester that the Jesse Scouts play a huge role. They are actively involved in gaining resources, and one of the resources that they had cultivated was an African-American spy. It was a civilian who was a slave known as Thomas Laws. And Thomas Laws is used as a conduit to deliver a message to another woman who was a collaborator for the Union, Rebecca Wright. And it's the Jesse Scouts that cultivate these contacts, and they're responsible for furnishing really some of the most important intelligence at that time in 1864. That Jubal Early, whose army was encamped outside of Winchester, Virginia, and controlled much of the Shenandoah Valley. It's one of the missions that he provided a month earlier was a direct attack on Washington, D.C., which nearly succeeded. And this raid on D.C. was multi-pronged. It nearly took the capital, which would have ended the war. But there was a possibility to seize a prisoner of war complex at Point Lookout. And Henry Gilmore also had an entirely other operation. But the Jesse Scouts were able to glean some strategic level intelligence that Early had moved a brigade of his army back to Richmond to help defend Petersburg. And that information allowed General Sheridan to attack Jubal Early's army. And it led to the direct victory at the Third Battle of Winchester, which then elevated President Lincoln's chances at the election, for the election of 1864. The other aspect of this book that's really interesting is how the Confederate Secret Service was not only involved in things that we look at as more or less traditional, unconventional warfare, but also political influence operations. And they were very actively involved in influencing the election of 1864, specifically involved in influencing the Copperhead movement, which was a peace movement, if you will, within the Democratic Party. And from their headquarters, one portion of their headquarters, which is in Montreal, they plied the Copperhead movement with large amounts of money to write the campaign platform for 1864 and influence it, which would have been an armistice, which would have changed the course of the war. Various things with press influence operations, which were fascinating. I mean, the war we look at is almost preordained in many cases in 1864, when it was hardly the case. It was looked at by the northern and southern populations in many ways as a forever war, and people were very fatigued. And the Secret Service was actively involved with many of the northern newspapers to write stories about a forever war, which is fascinating in how it was unwinnable. And if we look at insurgencies from the perspective of the 20th century, for instance, and in the 21st centuries, they don't have to win. They only need to merely survive. And the South was, unfortunately, in a very good position to survive. And the things that they were doing from an unconventional warfare and special operations perspective were novel, and they were moving in that direction. And it's the Jesse Scouts in many ways that worked those efforts, directly and indirectly.
Patrick, describe for our audience the plot to initially kidnap and then subsequently assassinate President Lincoln, Vice President Johnson, and Secretary of War Seward.
This is an aspect of the book that I initially wasn't sure I wanted to even embroil myself into, because I wanted the book to be the primary focus of the book is about the Union Scouts, and the Scouts are the Jesse Scouts, which involved, men that were doing tactical reconnaissance. They were leading the armies. One other aspect of the Jesse Scouts was known as Blazers Independent Scouts. They were an Ohio group. They were the first hunter-killer teams to go after men like Mosby. And I really wanted to focus on them. But what happened was that there was an intersection between my main characters, specifically Richard Blazer, who was in charge of this hunter-killer team, and Lewis Powell. And Lewis Powell was one of Mosby's Rangers' greatest Rangers. But he's often looked at as, quote, Lewis the Terrible, etc. But my book, I did a very deep dive into Lewis Powell. And why Lewis Powell is important is because he's one of John Wilkes Booth's main conspirators. He's the muscle, in many ways, behind Booth's plot. And once you start to unravel Lewis Powell, it's like unraveling an onion. You realize that there is a massive organization behind Booth himself. And what I did with the Unvanquished is brought the receipts to the table. And I let the reader come to their own conclusions. As you can see, though, as the kidnapping plot, there's a kidnapping plot that begins in 1864, which is an extensive one. They are surveilling the president, early in 64. Let me step back 1 second. There's something called the Dahlgren Raid, which is a Union raid led by a young officer by the name of Dahlgren and Kilpatrick, who's another aspect of the raid. And this raid is directed at Richmond, and it's a decapitation mission. Their goal is to infiltrate the city, burn it to the ground, and also kill Jefferson Davis and the Confederate leadership. And what happens, though, is the raid is thwarted, and there are literally orders in Dahlgren's leg, it's a false leg, that are written by the Secretary of War authorizing him to do the kidnapping and killing of Confederate leaders. And this creates a massive firestorm. The Union denies it initially, and for decades, it's considered potentially a false operation that the Confederacy had just made up. And the reality is it was something that was authorized. But it sets in motion the South's efforts to basically act in kind. And their initial operation is one to kidnap the president, because they recognize that the greatest supporter of the war is President Abraham Lincoln. And if they can somehow remove him from the process, they may be in a better negotiating position. So I tell the story of the kidnapping plot. And that involves a very elaborate plot to kidnap the president. It involves John Wilkes Booth. It also involves John Singleton Mosby and his Rangers, where an entire, almost half of his force is moved down to the northern neck of Virginia. And it's always explained that they're there for forage, etc. It's in the wintertime. It doesn't make really any sense, other than the fact that they were there as a security force to bring the president, through the northern neck after he was captured by Booth, after they brought him through Maryland, etc. And I tell the story of the kidnapping, and I also tell the story of Lewis Powell and how he's handled extensively by the Confederate Secret Service on every element of his operations. It's not like what the typical story is that Lewis Powell is this ranger that's really deranged, and he just suddenly gets sick of the war and decides to become a civilian. And then all of a sudden he shows up in Baltimore, and then all of a sudden he just meets John Wilkes Booth, and then the rest is history. And what you see is that there's a real pattern here, and there's an organization, and there's money behind it, and a lot of money behind it. And I put the pieces together. What is impossible to prove, though, is whether or not Jefferson Davis directly ordered that operation. But all of the pieces seem to point to that. And I also bring out another aspect of an operation that occurs a week before, where the Confederate Secret Service attempts to blow up the White House with Mosby. And I unearthed that other untold story as well. And the pieces are there, and I let the reader kind of decide what they think. But it's not just a bunch of, what I think is the revelation is, it's not just a bunch of guys that met at Mrs. Surratt's boarding house and decided to kidnap the president. There's a long story there, and there's a lot of receipts and a lot of evidence.
Patrick, moving fast forward a bit, have many of these techniques and the tradecraft migrated into modern operations, both the OSS in World War II and in modern day times?
Absolutely. What I think we have as American history is a very rich history of irregular warfare, beginning even prior to the 1670s in Benjamin Church. And it's this scale of a sine curve in many ways, where we develop tactics and techniques and then forget about them. And it's developed, it's forgotten. And the book begins in Wild Bill Donovan's office in 1941, where he's the coordinator of information. And it's the realization that America does not possess any form of special operations capability or of regular warfare. And he writes the president a desperate letter. And the letter I unearthed is actually in 1940, where he says, we need to return to the traditions of the scouts and rangers, men of daring, to bring back those traditions. And he looks back, it's his idea that to utilize many of the scholars that he has within the SS to look at the first modern war, which is the American Civil War, and what we were doing then, because there was nothing to really look at with World War I, the war that he participated in. And so they look back at the Scouts and Rangers and the Confederate Secret Service for some inspiration. And what you see is this inspiration is imbued in the Jedburghs, the operational groups, the OSS Maritime Unit, the Special Activities Branch, which then becomes the Special Operations Branch. There's a whole story there, which I've written in several of my other books, but really it's its own separate book of how that inspiration went into many of these units. And then it was forgotten again and had to be resurrected by men like Aaron Bank and many others in the 1950s. So there is a very rich tradition of special operations history that begins even prior to the Civil War, but is enhanced during the American Civil War, and it's imbued and exists to this day in our special operators.
Well, the name of the book is The Unvanquished. It is a fascinating read. I recommend it to our audience, and I want to thank Patrick K. O'Donnell for both an interesting and very informative interview.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me, Jim.
AFIO is a small, nonprofit, apolitical, educational organization whose main mission is to help prepare the next generation of intelligence officers to confront the challenges our nation faces in the years ahead. To learn more or support our outreach program, visit www.afio.com.